Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled slightly as he raised his camera, but it was not fear that made them shake. It was disbelief. In front of him, on the sun-baked tarmac of Clark Air Base in Luzon, stood an intact Mitsubishi G4M bomber, the aircraft. Allied pilots had come to know by a simple, almost mocking nickname, Betty. Its tail number was 763-12. Its cylindrical fuselage gleamed in the tropical light like polished metal on display, not a war machine abandoned in retreat. McCoy had spent years examining twisted wreckage of Japanese aircraft across the Pacific, but this one was different. This one was whole. And as he would soon realize, this one would also expose a design philosophy so alien to Western thinking that it would change the way American pilots understood their enemy. Before we dive into that story, if you love deep, untold stories of World War II technology strategy and the men who flew and fought, then take a moment to subscribe to my channel www.2untoldbattles. Your support helps bring to light the hidden decisions, the forgotten aircraft, and the hard lessons written in fire and aluminum across wartime skies. From a distance, there was nothing obviously wrong with Betty 763-12. The aircraft sat on its tricycle landing gear like a giant metal cigar resting on the apron. From nose to tail, it stretched nearly 20 meters, with wings spanning about 25 meters tip to tip. There were no jagged tears in the metal, no shredded flaps, no broken landing gear. The twin 14-cylinder radial engines, each producing in the region of 1,500 horsepower, looked untouched by combat or crash. To any casual observer, this was a bomber ready to be fueled, armed, and sent back into the sky. But when McCoy and his technical air intelligence team opened the access panels on the wings and crawled inside, the illusion of normality shattered. Where he expected to find heavy armor plates or thick layers of rubber around the fuel tanks, he found only thin aluminum, barely a couple of millimeters thick. No self-sealing compound. No protective rubber layers that would swell and close a bullet hole when soaked with fuel. No fixed fire suppression lines snaking through the wing. Just bare metal and tanks filled in combat with thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel. For a man trained on American doctrine, it seemed madness. Every experience in the European and Pacific theaters had taught Allied crews that unprotected fuel tanks were almost suicidal. A bomber could withstand flak damage, lost engines, and a shredded wing rib, so long as its fuel tanks did not burst into roaring flame. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in the thousands, deliberately built so that a few cannon shells or a short burst of machine gun fire along the wing could turn it into a flying torch. McCoy had pored over dozens of crashed Japanese aircraft in jungles, on beaches, and on coral atolls, but the violence that had torn them apart always left room for doubt. Was this fragility the result of impact or of deliberate design? Was a missing armor plate ripped away by a crash or never installed in the first place? 763-12 removed those doubts. It was intact. Nothing essential had been torn away by collision with the ground or by salvage crews. What he saw was what the designers had intended. This single aircraft, abandoned during the American liberation of Clark Field in early 1945, would become the physical key to a far larger mystery. Why had the Japanese Navy accepted such an obvious vulnerability? Why would any Air Force field a bomber that, in the words of countless American pilots, went up like a one-shot lighter? To answer that question, we have to step back in time to when Betty was not yet a symbol of vulnerability and sacrifice, but rather the sharp edge of Japan's aerial spear. On the morning of December 8, 1941, as smoke still rose over Pearl Harbor, another formation of Japanese aircraft was already in the air. 82 G4M Betty bombers and 26 older G3M Nell bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa. Their target was Clark Field, the main American airbase in the Philippines. The mission would demonstrate exactly why the Japanese Navy had demanded an aircraft with extraordinary range and speed, and why the early war environment made Betty appear almost invincible. Around 12:35 in the afternoon, the formation arrived over Clark Field at about 20,000 feet, cruising serenely above the effective reach of most American anti-aircraft guns in the area. 27 of the bombers from the initial wave opened their bomb bays and rained hundreds of bombs onto the runways, hangars, and parked aircraft below 600 and more weapons, smashing into concrete and steel. Moments later, Zero fighters swept in at treetop height, stitching the airfield with machine gun and cannon fire, finishing what the bombs had begun. Of the 17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed where they stood. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to smoking rubble. In roughly 3/4 of an hour, American air power in the Philippines was effectively wiped out. Lieutenant James Harrington, one of the few surviving pilots, watched from the relative safety of a bomb shelter as the Japanese formation turned northward and disappeared into the high blue sky. What struck him most was not just the destruction, but the calm, ordered way in which it had been delivered. Perfect formation. High altitude. Completely out of reach. No American fighter so much as got airborne in time to contest the raid. When the few survivors managed to get into the air later, the sky was empty. The Bettys had come, dealt their blow, and departed untouched. It was the kind of mission the aircraft had been built for: long-range strike from distant bases delivered against an unprepared enemy who could not yet fight back. That ability to reach far beyond the range of Allied bombers would become a defining feature of the Betty's first year of combat. 2 days after Clark Field, on December 10, 1941, G4M Bettys and G3M Nells combined to deliver one of the most shocking naval defeats in British history. Off the coast of Malaya, a British naval group known as Force Z steamed toward danger. It centred on 2 proud capital ships, the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse. Naval power in the age of dreadnoughts and battle lines still seemed to rest on thick armour belts, big guns, and the willingness to close within range of the enemy's artillery. Yet the Japanese Navy had something else in mind. Around 20 minutes past noon, Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves. G4M Bettys carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing roughly 840 kilograms, with a warhead of about 205 kilograms of high explosive. Crucially, these torpedoes had been designed specifically for shallow water, able to run at depths that allowed them to strike ships in coastal areas where traditional torpedoes might plunge too deep. What followed was a demonstration of precision and discipline that stunned British observers. Torpedo runs were executed in well-timed groups converging on their targets from different angles. Prince of Wales, representing the newest British battleship design and displacing around 43,000 tons, took at least 6 torpedo hits, in addition to damage from level bombing. Explosions below the waterline tore great wounds in her hull. Flooding spread through compartments faster than damage control teams could respond. The ship began to list heavily. Repulse, a veteran of the First World War but extensively modernized in the 1930s, maneuvered furiously to avoid the incoming weapons, and for a time seemed to dance between white wakes of torpedoes. Her gunners managed to shoot down several attacking aircraft, but it was not enough. She absorbed at least 4 torpedo hits. The cumulative damage from both attacks proved fatal. Within hours, both Prince of Wales and Repulse had capsized and sunk beneath the waves. 800 and more British sailors died. The survivors clung to life until they were rescued by accompanying destroyers. The entire engagement from first sighting to final sinking lasted less than 2 hours. For the first time in history, capital ships actively defending themselves on the high seas had been destroyed solely by air power. No battleship guns, no surface torpedoes, no submarine attacks, only bombers and their aerial torpedoes. And among those bombers, the G4M Betty stood at the center of the action. In the opening months of the Pacific War, the aircraft seemed almost to defy geography. Allied pilots encountered Betty bombers in nearly every major engagement across the theater. They struck Darwin, Australia from bases roughly 1,500 miles away. They attacked Port Moresby from airfields across the rugged spine of New Guinea's mountain ranges. They hammered Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance of more than 600 miles, projecting Japanese air power across vast ocean spaces that Allied planners had once assumed were natural buffers. Forward-based American fighters rarely had the range to intercept Betty formations departing from these distant airfields. Allied bases found themselves under attack from locations that lay beyond their own striking reach. This asymmetry in bomber capability gave Japanese forces a degree of strategic flexibility that the Allies struggled to match. For roughly the first 6 months of the war, the Betty's long legs and respectable speed allowed it to participate in almost every Japanese offensive operation in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. It bombed airfields, harbours, supply depots and troop concentrations from Malaya to the Netherlands, East Indies, from New Guinea to the Solomon Islands. It also flew reconnaissance missions that pushed far beyond the radius of Allied aircraft, identifying targets and guiding naval operations. At this stage, the bomber's effectiveness depended on a condition the Japanese planners had assumed would persist: limited and scattered Allied fighter opposition. When Betty formations could climb to high altitude beyond anti-aircraft, fire, deliver their weapons and withdraw before interceptors could climb to meet them, the aircraft was devastating. In that narrow window of time, it appeared that the uncompromising focus on range and payload had been the right call. But war is not a static equation. The battlefield changes, and with it the meaning of every engineering decision. By mid-1942, the tactical picture in the Pacific began to shift. The United States Navy and Marine Corps were bringing more fighters into the theater. Pilot training improved rapidly under the harsh conditions of combat. Tactics evolved as American aviators learned, often the hard way, where Japanese aircraft were strongest and where they were weak. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, once seen as barely adequate, was gradually supplemented, and then replaced by faster and more powerful F-6F Hellcats and Chance-Vought F-4U Corsairs. With each month, interception of Japanese bombers became more likely, and unopposed bombing runs became rarer. The change from theory to bloody reality came into sharp focus on August 8, 1942, during the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign. On that day, 23 G-4M bombers from the 4th Air Group departed Rabaul to attack American positions around the newly captured airfield on Guadalcanal. The distance from Rabaul to the island was roughly 600 miles, exactly the kind of mission the Betty had been built to fly. But this time the Americans were ready. American fighters intercepted the formation over the waters near Savo Island. What followed was not a one-sided massacre of ships and airfields, but a brutal slaughter of the attacking bombers. Of the 23 Bettys that had set out, 18 were shot down. Approximately 120 Japanese aviators died in that single engagement. It was the worst loss of G-4M bombers in a single mission during the entire campaign. Fighter pilots reported a chilling common observation: the Bettys seemed to ignite with terrifying ease. A few bursts fired into the wings or fuselage, a handful of rounds striking near the engines or along the center section of the wing, and the aircraft did not simply trail smoke and limp away. It disintegrated in blossoming spheres of fire, sometimes breaking apart in mid-air before plummeting into the sea. The bomber quickly acquired grim nicknames among American crews: Flying Cigar, Flying Zippo, One-Shot Lighter. Each name captured the same brutal truth: once hit, the Betty burned. By October 1942, when Lieutenant Commander John Thomas Blackburn arrived at Guadalcanal to take command of Fighter Squadron VF-17 flying F-4U Corsairs, the bomber's reputation had transformed completely. What had once been a symbol of long-range Japanese reach was now seen as one of the most vulnerable targets in the sky. Blackburn later recalled that the first time his pilots engaged a formation of Bettys, they were stunned by how quickly the aircraft went down. Hits anywhere along the fuselage or wings seemed to trigger catastrophic fires. American pilots began actively hunting Betty formations, recognizing them as both dangerous if ignored and unusually easy to destroy if intercepted. Yet even as pilots were learning these lessons in blood and smoke, the deeper engineering story remained unclear. Why exactly were these bombers so vulnerable? Was it poor construction quality, inferior materials, weak structural design? Pilots could describe what happened when they opened fire, but it would take the capture of intact Japanese airfields and relatively undamaged aircraft to reveal why. The first major breakthrough came in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the aircraft abandoned on the ground were several G-4M Betty bombers. Some had suffered modest combat damage. Others seemed simply to have been left behind in the rush to withdraw. For the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific, it was an opportunity too valuable to ignore. Engineers removed wing access panels and began a systematic examination of the fuel systems. Their findings confirmed in cold, technical detail what American and Australian pilots had seen in combat. The fuel tanks were of thin aluminum construction with no protective layering. There was no rubber sealant to swell and close holes caused by bullets. There was no fire-resistant coating applied to the tanks. Most importantly, there were no integrated fire suppression lines routed directly to the fuel cells. Everything that Western doctrine considered essential to prevent catastrophic fire in a damaged bomber was absent. This was no accident and no temporary expedient. Multiple Bettys examined at Buna showed the same configuration. This was standard Japanese design, not field modification or wartime improvisation. For the engineers and analysts, the implications were staggering. By 1942, American bombers almost universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had incorporated them from the C model onward. The consolidated B-24 Liberator had them from the earliest prototypes. Even long-range fighters like the Lockheed P-38 Lightning and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt carried protected fuel systems. In each case, self-sealing technology involved layers of rubber that would swell when soaked with fuel, closing around punctures and preventing large continuous leaks. It was not perfect and it could not save aircraft from every hit, but it dramatically improved the chances that a damaged bomber would not become an airborne funeral pyre. The price for that protection was weight. Rubber reinforcing straps, additional fittings, and integrated fire suppression lines all added kilograms. Entire sections of the airframe had to be strengthened to support these heavier tanks. Armor plating installed around crew positions and vital systems added hundreds more kilograms. American military doctrine accepted this weight penalty as unavoidable. Trained crews gained at the cost of time, money, and casualty-filled training were considered more valuable than individual airframes. A nation with the industrial capacity of the United States could build more airplanes. It could not instantly replace experienced pilots and gunners. Standing in half-disassembled Betty airframes at Buna, the Allied engineers were confronted with a very different set of priorities. The G4M had clearly been designed with a ruthless focus on range and speed, and protection had been almost entirely sacrificed to achieve those goals. The full magnitude of that sacrifice became even clearer when Major McCoy and his team were given access to the intact Betty at Clark Field in January 1945. Unlike the damaged airframes at Buna, 763-12 was pristine. Over a period of 3 weeks, McCoy and his specialists dismantled and documented every system on the bomber. Their resulting report, classified secret and circulated among Allied air forces, set out the specifications and design choices that defined the Betty. What they found on paper looked at first glance impressively efficient. The G4M Model 1's empty weight was around 6,700 and more kilograms, remarkably light for a twin-engine bomber with its size and fuel capacity. Its maximum takeoff weight was roughly 9,500 kilograms. It carried around 4,780 liters of fuel distributed across 8 tanks, 4 in each wing. Its top speed was about 428 kilometers per hour, or roughly 265 miles per hour. It could fly to heights of around 8,500 meters. Its crew of 7 included a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The fuel system layout drew particular attention. The 8 tanks were arranged in 4 pairs along the wing's longitudinal axis at the root where the wing joined the fuselage. From an engineering perspective, this arrangement made excellent sense for one narrow goal capacity. The thickest part of the wing structure offered the most volume for fuel cells without overly compromising aerodynamics or structural integrity. By filling this space with fuel, the designers could maximize range without turning the fuselage into a giant flying tank. But in combat terms, the placement was disastrous. Any attack from the side or from below that intersected the wing root area would inevitably pass through or near the fuel tanks. The thin aluminum walls of these tanks provided no resistance. The absence of self-sealing compounds meant that bullets piercing the tanks would create open channels for fuel to pour out, atomize into mist in the airstream, and ignite at the slightest spark. The lack of armor meant no barrier existed between burning fuel and the rest of the airframe. American engineers calculated that by omitting self-sealing systems, armor plating, and comprehensive fire suppression equipment, The Betty's designers had saved more than 500 kilograms of weight. In a machine that counted kilograms as carefully as a merchant counts coins, this was a significant gain. Those saved kilograms had been turned into fuel, and therefore range. But the cost in vulnerability was equally quantifiable. Combat reports showed that Betty's struck anywhere in the wing area almost always exploded or burned. The fuel tanks created what the analysts described as a critical failure point, a single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. To understand how such a design could be approved, one must go even further back to the late 1930s when the Imperial Japanese Navy first issued its requirements for a new land-based attack bomber. In September 1937, long before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy drafted specifications that would determine the G4M's fate. Those requirements reflected not only technical ambitions but a worldview shaped by geography and strategy. Japan's empire stretched across enormous distances. Its home islands, its possessions in Formosa and the Mandated Islands, its ambitions toward Southeast Asia and the Pacific, all were separated by vast stretches of ocean. Aircraft carriers offered one route to project power, but the Navy also wanted land-based bombers that could range far beyond the reach of carrier-borne aircraft. These bombers would need to strike enemy bases, fleets at anchor, shipping lanes, and forward positions across thousands of kilometers of water. They would need to operate from islands and coastal airfields, and still reach deep into enemy territory. The requirements laid down in 1937 were accordingly demanding. The new bomber was expected to reach a top speed around 398 kilometers per hour, operate at cruising altitudes near 3,000 meters, and have an unloaded range of about 4,700 and more kilometers. Carrying an 800-kilogram bomb or torpedo load, it still needed a range of roughly 3,700 kilometers. At the time, no bomber in service anywhere could meet those numbers. The G3M Nell, then the mainstay of Japanese land-based bomber forces, had a maximum range in the neighborhood of 3,000 kilometers. Early variants of the American B-17 Flying Fortress had even more limited reach. The Navy's requirement was not a minor improvement but a leap far beyond the existing state-of-the-art. It was calculated directly by plotting the distances between prospective bases and likely targets from Formosa to Clark Field, from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, from the Japanese home islands to possible objectives across the western Pacific. The bomber that could fly those routes would give Japan strategic options that no other nation possessed. But embedded within these requirements were assumptions about future warfare that would later prove disastrously optimistic. Planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide sufficient protection for long-range bomber formations. They believed that enemy fighter forces, constrained by shorter range and fewer suitable bases, would rarely be able to intercept Japanese bombers at the farthest reaches of their missions. They expected wars to be decided quickly, before an opponent like the United States could bring its full industrial power to bear and flood the skies with interceptors. With those assumptions in mind, the Navy passed the specifications to Mitsubishi. The man who would ultimately bear the responsibility for turning them into an actual aircraft was Kiro Honjo. Honjo was no amateur. He had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s, absorbing European engineering methods, production techniques, and aerodynamic principles. When he took over leadership of the G4M design team from Joji Hattori, he understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand harsh compromises that Western air forces might never accept. At Mitsubishi's facilities in Nagoya, Honjo assembled a team of engineers and set them to work on what was essentially a mathematical puzzle with life-or-death consequences. Every component from the thickness of the spars to the size of the windows became part of a weight budget. The team examined existing bombers from multiple nations, identifying where weight could be saved without allowing the wings to collapse or the fuselage to tear itself apart under stress. They experimented with new construction techniques, seeking structures that were strong yet as light as possible. Very quickly, the brutal logic of the problem became clear. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed enormous fuel capacity. Every liter of aviation gasoline weighed roughly 0.8 kilograms. 4,780 liters of fuel, the amount the Betty would eventually carry in its main configuration, meant around 3,800 kilograms of fuel alone when the tanks were full. That fuel had to be supported by wings, pumps, and plumbing, and still leave enough weight allowance for engines, structure crew weapons, and basic equipment. Fuel was heavy, protection was heavy. Armor plating sufficient to shield crew positions and critical systems would weigh hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing tanks would add thick rubber layers and reinforcement, adding even more mass. Fixed fire suppression systems with pipelines, valves, and extinguishing bottles were not weightless either. Redundant safety features such as backup pumps, extra wiring, and additional structural members all added to the scale. The cumulative price of making the aircraft resilient in combat was measured in hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000 kilograms. Honjo and his team ran the numbers. If they tried to incorporate comprehensive protection, the bomber could not carry enough fuel to meet the Navy's range requirement. If they reduced fuel to keep weight manageable, the aircraft would fail to reach the distances that strategy demanded. They were trapped between two mutually exclusive goals, survivability and strategic reach. At some point in those calculations, a line was crossed. Honjo concluded that if the Navy's performance demands could not be negotiated downward, then protection would have to be sacrificed. The fuel tanks would be constructed of light aluminum without self-sealing compounds. The armor plating around crew stations and vital systems would be minimized or omitted. Fire suppression beyond portable extinguishers would not be installed. Every kilogram saved in these areas would be invested back into fuel and aerodynamic cleanliness in service of range and speed. This decision was not taken lightly. The designers understood that unprotected fuel tanks in the wing roots would become lethal weaknesses under fire. They anticipated that a bomber that was hit, especially in the wings, would likely be lost. But within the constraints of 1937 technology and the Navy's unyielding specifications, they saw no alternative. They could build an aircraft that met performance requirements with known vulnerabilities, or one that fell short of strategic expectations but protected its crews better. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo chose to give them exactly that. The prototype G4M flew for the first time on October 23, 1939. From a flight test perspective, the results vindicated the design team. The bomber met or exceeded the Navy's demands. It flew faster than required, ranged farther than predicted, and carried payloads that satisfied operational needs. In a purely technical sense, the aircraft was a success. The design entered production as the Navy Type 1 attack bomber. By April 1941, G4M Model 1 aircraft were reaching frontline units. By December of that year, roughly 180 were in service. As the early wartime missions against Clark Field Force Z Darwin and countless other targets demonstrated, the bomber performed brilliantly when the assumptions behind its design held true. When fighter opposition was limited, when Japanese forces controlled the initiative, when long-range attacks could be carried out from bases beyond enemy striking distance, the Betty was devastating. In that narrow slice of time, the decision to sacrifice protection for range looked on the surface like a masterstroke. The problem was that the war did not remain within that narrow slice. The Guadalcanal campaign forced the G4M to operate in a very different environment from that envisioned in 1937 war games and planning papers. Now American fighters were present in growing numbers. Airfields like Henderson Field on Guadalcanal allowed Allied pilots to launch interceptions at multiple points along Japanese bomber routes. Radar and improved communications gave earlier warning and more precise vectoring. Tactics evolved as American pilots learned to attack from angles that exposed the Betty's weaknesses most directly, especially from the side and below where shots would rake the fuel-rich wing routes. From August through October 1942, the sky over the Solomons became a deadly proving ground for every assumption built into the Betty's design. Mission after mission, G4M formations departed. Rabaul flew the hundreds of miles to Guadalcanal and were met by increasingly well-coordinated fighter opposition. The result was attrition on a scale that Japanese planners had not predicted. More than 100 G4M bombers were lost during the campaign along with their crews. The mission on August 8 alone cost 18 out of 23 aircraft and about 120 airmen. Losses continued on August 9, August 10 and onward through the month. As the weeks passed, the 4th Air Group, which had begun the campaign as a formidable striking force, was effectively bled out and destroyed as an operational unit. September brought no relief. The strategic need to project power onto Guadalcanal did not diminish simply because losses were high. Betty bombers remained the Imperial Navy's only land-based platform, capable of delivering meaningful payloads from Rabaul to the contested island. So the missions continued, and so did the losses. In October, American fighter strength grew as more squadrons arrived. Pilots gained combat experience. Tactics became more refined. Betty formations found themselves intercepted more often and more effectively than ever before. By November, when Japanese forces finally abandoned attempts to retake Guadalcanal, Betty losses in the campaign had surpassed 100 aircraft with crew deaths approaching 700 men. There was almost no middle ground for these crews. A Betty either returned home essentially untouched or it did not return at all. Unlike American bombers that sometimes limped back with engines shot out fuselages riddled with holes and crew members wounded, but alive the G4M had little tolerance for damage. An incendiary round or cannon shell in the wrong place transformed it into a burning wreck. If fuel tanks ignited, crews rarely had time to bail out. Many simply vanished in fireballs, leaving only floating debris on the ocean surface. Japanese planners had anticipated casualties. No one believed that war could be fought without loss. But the scale and asymmetry of the Betty's loss rate overwhelmed even pessimistic assumptions. Every mission became a gamble in which the odds leaned steadily against survival. The very feature that had enabled the bomber's early success, its huge, unprotected fuel capacity, now ensured that once enemy fighters had the initiative, its crews would pay the maximum possible price for every interception. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that something had to change. Starting with the 663rd G4M produced in March of that year, modifications were introduced. 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath the wing surfaces in the regions where the fuel tanks were located. The idea was to provide at least some protection against small-caliber hits, slowing the rate of leakage and lessening the chance that a single puncture would produce an immediate fireball. On paper, this might have seemed a reasonable compromise. The additional rubber added some weight-reducing top speed by around 9 km per hour and maximum range by approximately 315 km. In exchange, engineers hoped to improve survivability. In practice, the change did very little. Against heavy machine gun fire and cannon shells, the thin rubber sheets were overwhelmed. They might slow leakage from a few rifle-caliber hits, but they could not prevent the ignition of fuel vapors from larger projectiles. They did not transform the Betty into a robust bomber. They merely blunted the edge of its vulnerability in marginal cases. A more comprehensive attempt at protection came with the G4M Model 3 introduced late in the war around October 1944. This version, sometimes designated Model 34, finally incorporated true self-sealing fuel tanks. Capacity was reduced to about 4,490 litres to make room for the sealing material. Maximum range dropped to roughly 3,640 kilometres, more than 2,000 kilometres less than that of the original Model 1. In exchange, the bomber gained significantly better resistance to fuel fires from small and medium-caliber hits, at least in theory. But strategic and industrial reality rendered this improvement almost moot. By the time Model 3 aircraft began to appear, American air superiority over much of the Pacific was overwhelming. Radar coverage, long-range fighters, and aggressive patrol tactics meant that any large Japanese bomber formation was likely to be detected and attacked well before reaching its targets. In addition, Japanese industry could produce only a small number of Model 3 aircraft. Depending on the source, somewhere between 60 and slightly under 100 were completed before the war ended. That was not enough to change the historical record the earlier models had already written in blood and smoke. The consequences of the Betty's vulnerabilities were not limited to anonymous formations over remote islands. They also played out in some of the most famous missions of the Pacific War, including the death of the man who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor. On April 18, 1943, the G4M would again appear at the center of a story that combined technical design with strategic choices. American cryptanalysts had intercepted and decoded Japanese communications indicating that Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville that day. The message was detailed, listing departure, time route, and even aircraft types. It stated that Yamamoto would travel aboard a G-4M bomber, escorted by 0 fighters. The United States decided to act. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron were assigned to intercept the flight, though only 16 would eventually complete the mission due to a blown tire and a drop tank failure during takeoff. The mission required extraordinary precision. The P-38s would have to fly more than 400 miles from Guadalcanal to the intercept point, hugging the ocean at wave-top height around 50 feet above the water to avoid Japanese radar detection. They would have to navigate by dead reckoning over featureless sea, relying on compass headings, wind estimates, and time. The margin for error was razor-thin. If they arrived too early, they might be spotted by other Japanese aircraft or by ground observers. If they arrived too late, Yamamoto's flight would already have crossed the intercept point and escaped. The entire operation rested on careful calculation and the pilot's ability to hold formation and heading for hours without radio chatter or visual navigation aids. At 7:25 in the morning, the P-38s departed Guadalcanal and dropped to near sea level. 2 aircraft were forced to turn back, one after blowing a tire, another after experiencing drop tank trouble. The remaining 16 pressed on engines droning just above the waves. For nearly 2 hours they flew that way, eyes fixed on instruments and horizon, trusting the mathematics. At 9:34, almost exactly on the planned schedule, the P-38s reached the projected intercept point and spotted their quarry. 2 G-4M bombers flew ahead, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. The American formation split. Some P-38s climbed to engage the escorting fighters while Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber maneuvered to attack the bombers. Barber closed on the lead Betty, the one carrying Yamamoto. He fired into the wing area exactly where the fuel tanks were located. The result was true to every engineering prediction that McCoy's team would later make on paper. The unprotected fuel tanks ruptured. Fuel sprayed into the slipstream, likely atomizing into a cloud of explosive mist. Tracer rounds and hot fragments ignited the mixture. The bomber burst into flame and crashed in the jungle below. Yamamoto was killed by injuries sustained in the crash. The second Betty was also shot down, killing everyone on board. The mission showcased several elements of Allied superiority: code breaking, operational planning, long-range navigation, and aggressive fighter tactics. It also illustrated once again that a Betty under sustained fighter attack had virtually no chance of survival. Once a burst of fire intersected its fuel-rich wing roots, the outcome was almost predetermined. 2 years later, in 1945, the G-4M would be at the center of another dramatic, though far more tragic demonstration of how design and doctrine could collide with reality. By March 1945, the Japanese military, facing relentless American offensives and the slow strangulation of blockade and bombardment, turned increasingly to desperate measures. Among these was the MXY-7 Oka, a manned rocket-powered glider designed for suicide attacks against ships. The Oka, which means cherry blossom, housed a pilot and a warhead of about 1,200 kilograms of explosive. It was intended to be carried under a bomber's fuselage to within roughly 20 kilometers of a target. Released there, it would ignite its rocket motor, accelerate to very high speed, and crash into an enemy vessel. The bomber chosen to carry Oka weapons was once again the G-4M. On March 21, 18, Betty bombers took off from Kanoya Air Base, each with an Oka slung beneath its fuselage. Their mission was to attack American naval forces off Okinawa. Fighter escorts accompanied them, but the burden of actually transporting the rocket bombs fell on the already vulnerable Betty. The combination was inherently dangerous. The Oka added enormous weight and drag, reducing the bomber's speed and maneuverability. Any hope of using evasive maneuvers during the approach was severely limited. The G-4Ms were even more vulnerable than usual, heavy and sluggish, their unprotected fuel tanks still sitting in the same deadly positions beneath their wings. American radar detected the formation at approximately 100 miles. F-6, F-Hellcat fighters from the carrier USS Hornet were scrambled to intercept. They reached the Japanese formation long before it could get within release range. What followed was a slaughter. Attacking from advantageous positions, the Hellcat pilots tore through the burdened Bettys. The bombers could not maneuver effectively. Their escorts were too few and too overmatched to stop the attack. One by one, the G4 Ms burst into flame and fell into the sea, their Oka weapons still attached. Not a single bomber survived to reach the release point. Not a single Oka was launched against the American fleet. 137 bomber crew members and 15 Oka pilots died in the operation. The mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's central flaw. The aircraft's extraordinary range on paper meant nothing when it could not survive the last 20 kilometers under modern fighter opposition. In a dark irony, the G4M's final significant mission would not be an attack at all, but an act of capitulation. On August 19, 1945, 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, 2 Betty bombers took off on a very different kind of flight. These aircraft were painted white and marked with large green crosses to indicate their peaceful intentions. They carried no bombs, no torpedoes, no armament beyond what was necessary to fly. Their call signs were Bataan 1 and Bataan 2, a deliberate reference to the site of one of the most humiliating early defeats suffered by American forces in the war. On board were Japanese representatives traveling to meet with Allied commanders to discuss surrender arrangements. One of the pilots was Lieutenant Den Sudo, who flew a G6M Model 1 transport variant, a Betty airframe converted to carry passengers and cargo rather than weapons. The aircraft retained its distinctive cylindrical fuselage and wing configuration. Its silhouette remained instantly recognizable, but its purpose had shifted from destruction to diplomacy. The flight from Atsugi Airfield to the tiny island of Iijima covered roughly 1,000 kilometers, well within the bomber's range, even in its modified form. American fighters escorted the white bombers along their route, ensuring both that they were protected and that they adhered strictly to the planned path. The escort symbolized both control and a kind of wary guardianship. The Bettys were no longer enemies to be destroyed, but vessels carrying the first tangible steps toward the war's end. Upon reaching Iijima, the Japanese delegation transferred to an American C-54 transport aircraft for further travel to Manila, where the surrender details would be worked out. It was a scene thick with symbolism. The same type of bomber that had annihilated American air power at Clark Field and helped sink British capital ships in 1941 now flew painted in white under Allied escort, bringing envoys who would formalize Japan's acceptance of defeat. In a sense, the war's aerial story had come full circle. While those white Bettys flew under truce markings, the airframe that Major McCoy had examined at Clark Field earlier in the year sat silent, its engines cool, its tanks empty, its panels removed for inspection. The crew of 763-12 had survived the war not by trusting their aircraft but by walking away from it. Most Betty crews were not so fortunate. To understand the full weight of the decisions that created the G4M1 must look not only at tactical anecdotes and famous missions, but also at the cold statistics of production and loss. In total, Mitsubishi produced approximately 2,414 G4M aircraft across all variants, though some sources suggest slightly higher figures up to around 2,435 when every prototype and minor subtype is counted. The differences reflect how carefully or loosely one defines each variant and whether transport conversions are included as separate entries. Regardless of the exact figure, the conclusion is clear: the Betty was one of the most numerous bombers in Japanese service. The G4M Model 1, produced from 1941 through early 1943, accounted for roughly 1,172 aircraft. This was the version that entered service before Pearl Harbor fought at Clark Field and off Malaya, and flew the early long-range raids that shocked Allied planners. It carried around 4,780 liters of fuel, reached speeds of about 428 kilometers per hour, and could fly roughly 6,000 and more kilometers, making it the longest-ranged bomber in front line service anywhere in the world at that time. It also had no meaningful protection for its fuel tanks or crew against sustained fighter attack. The G4M Model 2, built from 1943 through 1945, represented an attempt to further refine performance within the same basic design philosophy. Approximately 1,142 Model II aircraft were produced. They carried even more fuel, around 6,490 litres, pushing their range beyond the already remarkable distances of the Model I. Top speed increased slightly to about 437 kilometers per hour. Yet the fundamental vulnerability remained. The fuel tanks were still unprotected, aluminum shells, and the bomber was still prone to catastrophic fires when hit. The G4M Model III, the only version with true self-sealing tanks, came too late and in too small numbers to matter. Between 60 and 90 Model III aircraft were completed before Japan's surrender. These aircraft reduced fuel capacity to around 4,490 litres and cut maximum range to about 3,640 kilometers, a reduction of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original Model I. In exchange, they gained a level of survivability against certain types of damage that earlier versions could only envy. But by the time they reached operational units, the sky was dominated by American fighters and American radar. No amount of marginal improvement in fuel system resilience could compensate for the near-total loss of air superiority. Transport variants like the G6M added roughly 30 more airframes, though they were modifications rather than entirely new designs. These aircraft served in liaison and communications roles, carrying personnel and cargo around the shrinking Japanese empire. One of them, as we have seen, flew in white paint and green crosses to escort Japan's surrender delegation. During the peak year of 1943, Mitsubishi's factories produced G4MIs at a rate of about 100 aircraft per month. Fueled by a war economy that had not yet been completely ruined by bombing and blockade, Mitsubishi's assembly lines put out Bettys in numbers that reflected the bomber's importance to Japanese strategy. However, as the war turned against Japan, Allied bombing campaigns began to disrupt industrial centers. Raw material shortages grew severe. In 1944 and 1945, production declined steadily and resources were increasingly redirected to fighter aircraft intended for homeland defense. Yet even at lower production rates, the problem was not the ability to build Bettys, it was the inability to keep them alive. Over the course of the war, Mitsubishi delivered roughly 2,400 G4MIs to operational units. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, only a handful of operational Bettys remained. Most had been destroyed in combat or lost to accidents, aggravated by the aircraft's unforgiving design. Very few survived long enough to be retired in an orderly fashion. Crew casualties followed the same grim pattern. Exact numbers are difficult to reconstruct from surviving records, but historians agree that thousands of Japanese aircrew died in G4MIs. The aircraft's design left little room for surviving serious damage. A Betty hit in its wings or central fuselage often became a fireball in seconds. Pilots and gunners had scant time to escape, especially at low altitude. Parachutes did little good in an aircraft that could go from intact to engulfed in exploding fuel in the time it took a man to reach the hatch. Surviving crews, those who flew dozens of missions and lived to tell about them, were unanimous about one thing. They flew in an aircraft that offered them almost no margin for error. Former Flight Petty Officer Masuato, who completed 28 combat missions before being transferred to training duties later, offered perhaps the most concise summary. The Betty, he said, was a magnificent aircraft that asked its crews to die for its range. They flew it because they were ordered to. They died in it because that was what it had been designed, in effect, to make them do. Masuato's words cut through the sterile language of specifications and engineering reports. They remind us that every kilogram of weight that Honjo's team shaved off armor and protection had an eventual human face. Each critical failure point in the fuel system translated in battle into burning metal and shattered lives. The Betty was not simply a machine. It was a moral choice cast in aluminum and gasoline. Nothing highlights that moral dimension more clearly than comparing the Betty with contemporary American bombers such as the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-25 Mitchell. The B-17 incorporated armor plating around the pilot and co-pilot positions with steel plates of several millimeters thickness, shielding them from frontal and dorsal fire. Additional armored bulkheads were installed along the fuselage to protect other key crew positions, such as the waist gunners and radio operator. The nose section where the bombardier sat featured armored glass and additional reinforcement. Crucially, self-sealing fuel tanks were standard from the C model onward. Everything about the aircraft's design reflected a philosophy that assumed it would be hit, and that the goal was to ensure it could survive those hits long enough to complete its mission, or at least bring its crew home. The B-25 Mitchell, a medium bomber, followed the same pattern. Armor backed the pilot and co-pilot seats. Fuel tanks included self-sealing compounds early in production. The result was a bomber with an empty weight of around 9,100 kilograms, roughly 2,000 kilograms, heavier than a G4M despite broadly similar size and role. Those extra kilograms represented armor self-sealing material, additional structure and other protective measures. American designers, backed by a vast industrial base, accepted that weight as the cost of doing business in the skies over Europe and the Pacific. The effectiveness of this philosophy was not merely assumed, it was measured. American wartime studies collected data on wound patterns, aircraft losses, and damaged aircraft that managed to return. They showed that body armor reduced fatalities from chest wounds from around 36% to around 8%, an improvement of more than 3/4. Self-sealing fuel tanks similarly reduced fire-related casualties by large margins. Aircraft equipped with such systems had survival rates 3 to 4 times higher than those without them when damaged in combat. Equally important was compartmentalization. Armored bulkheads, fire-resistant materials, and thoughtful layout prevented damage in one section of the aircraft from spreading unchecked to others. An engine fire might burn itself out or be extinguished without consuming the entire wing. A hit to a fuel tank might leak but not necessarily explode. Armored glass prevented pilots from being killed instantly by shrapnel in head-on attacks. Every piece of the protection puzzle worked together so that no single hit automatically doomed the crew. American doctrines treated trained crews as assets more valuable than individual airframes. This was not sentimentality, it was hard calculation. Training a bomber crew to operational proficiency required time fuel instructors and practice missions. Losing such a crew meant losing all of that investment. The United States was willing to pour steel and rubber into its bombers to reduce those losses, and its industrial strength made it possible to build thousands of such heavy, well-protected aircraft without crippling production numbers. Over 12,000 B-17s and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators were built. Japanese doctrine, as reflected in the G4M, answered the same questions differently. The Betty's design effectively treated the aircraft as a long-range weapon whose primary value lay in its ability to deliver bombs or torpedoes to distant targets. Crew survival was at best a secondary consideration, and at worst a collateral cost to be accepted as inevitable. The assumption that wars would be decided quickly, that opposition would remain limited, and that surprise would protect bomber formations underpinned this calculus. In that world, longer range and higher speed deserved the weight budget that American designers assigned to armor and self-sealing tanks. Once those underlying assumptions were broken by reality, the difference in philosophies produced very different outcomes. By mid-1942, American fighter strength in the Pacific had increased enough that Betty interception became routine. By late 1942, American pilots had developed tactics that ruthlessly exploited every vulnerability in the bomber's design. By 1943, many Betty missions were effectively suicide operations, with loss rates so high that surviving multiple tours required either exceptional luck or frequent reassignment. By 1944, Betty bombers struggled to operate in daylight against American defenses at all. Everything that had made the Betty formidable in early 1942 was still technically present. Its range remained amazing. Its speed, though no longer exceptional compared to newer fighters, was still respectable for a bomber. Its payload capacity remained adequate for torpedoes, bombs, or later weapons like the Oka. However, these qualities became irrelevant whenever the aircraft failed to survive to weapon release range. Range meant nothing if the bomber exploded when it was still 100 kilometers from its target. Speed meant little when radar-directed fighters could be vectored into interception positions far from the intended target area. Payload became academic when the bomber never reached the drop point. The investigation of tail number 763-12 at Clark Field in early 1945 brought all of these threads together into a single comprehensible narrative. The unprotected fuel tanks that shocked Major McCoy were not a mistake, not evidence of sloppy production or wartime shortcuts. They were the inevitable result of decisions made years earlier in design offices and naval staff meetings. Japanese designers had built precisely the machine they had been asked to build: a fast, long-range bomber with minimal weight optimized for a war of quick, far-reaching strikes against an enemy that would, they believed, struggle to intercept it. The problem was not primarily in the engineering. The problem was in the assumptions. 1937, Japan had designed a bomber for a short, decisive conflict in which initiative and surprise would always remain on its side. 1942 through 1945, Japan found itself embroiled in a prolonged industrial war against a continental power that could outproduce it in aircraft, fuel pilots, and radar stations. Once the environment changed, the mathematics of the Betty's War were written in fire and loss. When American engineers peered into the wing cavities of 763-12 and traced fuel lines along its spars, they were looking not just at metal and rivets, but at the physical manifestation of a strategic gamble. They saw a machine whose every kilogram testified to the belief that range mattered more than survival, that performance would compensate for vulnerability. They also saw in battle reports and wreckage photos the ledger where the cost of that belief was recorded: hundreds of flaming wrecks across the Pacific and thousands of aircrew who never came home. The Betty's story is therefore larger than a tale of one aircraft type. It speaks to fundamental questions about how nations approach war, how they value human life relative to strategic capability, and how designers balance the cold precision of engineering with the messy unpredictability of combat. The United States, with its flying fortresses and liberators, answered those questions by accepting heavy, expensive but survivable bombers. Japan, with its sleek, long-legged Bettys, answered by embracing range at the cost of protection. In the end, the nation that prioritized crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely, even while suffering heavy losses. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualty rates in exchange for performance built an air force that burned itself out through attrition. The thousands of burning G4 Ms that littered the Pacific sky were the visible proof. Tale number 7, 63-12, abandoned at Clark Field and dissected by McCoy's team, stands as the final piece of evidence. It confirms that the Betty was not a poorly designed bomber. It was in many ways a brilliantly designed aircraft built to meet very specific performance goals. The tragedy lies in the fact that those goals did not include bringing its crews home alive. If you want to keep exploring stories like this, where design decisions, human courage, and strategic miscalculations collide in the skies of World War II, make sure you subscribe to Two Untold Battles. There are many more aircraft missions and forgotten choices waiting to be uncovered, each with its own lessons about technology, war, and the price paid when capability is chased at the expense of survival.